Dinuba Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our online video Bible study about the chaotic first century world of Jesus, how he responded to that chaos, and what it means for us in our 21st century world. Now, you should all give yourselves a lot of congratulations and a big round of applause because you have made it halfway through this study. We've done 3 weeks, and we have, including this week, 3 weeks left in this particular series. So you're doing a great job hanging on with us and hanging in there. We appreciate you engaging with this study and being involved. So last week, and over the last couple of weeks before that, we've been looking at different groups of people within the Jewish community in the first century who were disagreeing with one another about how to approach the problem of Rome. The Roman Empire is occupying the Jewish people's land and is ruling over them, and there's a lot of disagreement about what should be done about that. What are the people to do? So last week we looked at the Sadducees and their attempt to solve the problem politically by collaborating with Rome to ensure their continued positions of power and wealth and status, and to try to find the best possible deal with Rome to ensure that was going to continue. 2 weeks before that, we looked at the Pharisees and their desire to purify not just themselves, but all of the people to create a holy nation that God would see fit to redeem. Now this week, we're taking a look at a third group that was disgusted by both the Sadducees and the Pharisees. We are taking a look at a group called the Essenes. Now, interestingly enough, the Essenes do not directly appear in the Gospels of Jesus' life or in the New Testament like the Sadducees and the Pharisees do. If you search the Bible for the term Essene, you're gonna come up empty. You're not going to find anything there. But there are traces of their belief in the Gospels and in the world that Jesus inhabited, and they do appear in the history of that time and of that region. Most profoundly, the community of Qumran, which was the famous community in which the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered just after the end of World War II in 1946. This was an Essene community, and it's because of their scholarship and their devotion to the scriptures that we have excellent ancient sources on the Old Testament, and we can compare the sources we had before that to look at the Old Testament to those scrolls that they had, and we can see that the Old Testament has been preserved very, very well for us, even in our own time. So I think the Essenes are probably one of the most fascinating groups of the first century, even though they're a little bit mysterious. It's likely that John the Baptist was an Essene of some kind, and the Gospel of Mark does treat John's disciples as a distinct group from the Pharisees and also from Jesus' own disciples. But that's about as close as we get when we look at the Bible. So let's dive in to take a look through history at who the Essenes were, what they believed, and how this compares to what Jesus taught. So as always, we'll start by looking at their name and what it means. There's some debate about the term and from where it derives. It's probably from the Greek esai, meaning the humble ones or the pious ones. And this is probably a pejorative term used by those who found the Essenes really irritating. It's said with exasperation and dread. It's like, oh no, we have to put away the fattening and delicious candy because now the Essenes are here and they say we should only eat plants. Some argue that the term could mean the silent ones, and we'll get to why in just a minute. And others don't think it's derived from Greek at all. Others think it might actually have come from Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus spoke. And they think it might mean the healer or the healers. Whether it's the pious ones or the silent ones or the healers, we can see that the Essenes were regarded as pretty devout by these names that people came up for them, and perhaps maybe even a little bit powerful in their own respective societies. But again, who are they? What are they about? The Essenes and the Pharisees have common roots. But the Essenes broke away from the Pharisees when they became convinced that just as the Sadducees had corrupted the temple, the Pharisees had corrupted the cities and the life of the people in the cities. The Sadducees were corrupt in their theology and their aloof elitism. And the Pharisees weren't going far enough in the eyes of the Essenes on their quest to be holy. So the Essenes fled the cities and went out into the wilderness to form their own movement, their own subculture, their own economic and social system, and their own villages outside of many major cities in that first century world in Palestine. They were dedicated to asceticism. And they were dedicated to that because they saw the chaos of the first century world, and they decided that they needed to be separate from that, so separate that they were going to forego the comforts and pleasures of the world as they knew it, and this as a way to discipline themselves. And this asceticism comes out in a few particular ways. They practiced very strict dietary laws within their communities, and were very concerned that they might make a mistake and eat something they're not supposed to and thus no longer be holy. They were afraid of being inconsistent with the law of Moses. One Essene was so worried about this that he refused to eat anything but herbs, which I think made him very, very unpopular when it came time for the potlucks, as you can imagine. The community was the essence of the Essenes, if you'll forgive the phrase. They lived communally in villages that they created outside major cities, and everyone supported that community through their labor. Any money that they made as tradesmen or as artisans would be put into a central treasury in the village, overseen by a trusted elder who was elected by the Essenes themselves. When someone had a need, they took what they needed from that treasury, of course, with the trusted elder providing supervision. An Essene did not claim ownership of his own clothes except for his undergarments. Each Essene had a light cloak for the summer months and a very heavy cloak for the winter months, but these actually didn't belong to the individual man. They belonged to the community. They belonged to the village. Essenes woke up together at the same time each morning before the sun had risen to recite prayers together and make devotions to God. This was not a casual exercise for the community, and it was understood that until these morning prayers were complete, no one could move from the kneeling position which they were in while they prayed. Not even if a venomous snake had appeared and was standing ready to strike someone in the leg or on the foot. Still had to stay in that position, kneeling and praying. Hopefully the whole snake thing was a pretty rare situation, but assuming everyone had survived and there were no snakes that morning, the next thing that they would do is they would have a communal meal together in relative peace and quiet. Now that might actually be where the idea of the Essenes as the silent ones comes from this practice of eating together in relative quiet together. And after this meal was done, they would head out to work. They would return 6 hours later to eat again for the final meal of the day, and they would also take that meal together again as one solid group. New recruits who were attempting to join an Essene community would take their meals alone outside the building where the Essenes within the community were, and they had to do this for a total of 3 years before they were admitted into the dining structure and could join the rest of the Essenes for that meal. So that's a pretty high barrier to entry for these Essene communities. There was also a very prominent mystical component to the Essenes. And as their members started to advance through the ranks and spent more time in an Essene community, they were slowly inducted into more and more advanced mysteries, many of which surrounded special names of God. The most important were usually the 12-letter name of God that they had deduced, and the 42-letter name of God that they had deduced. And it was this 42-letter name that they believed could unleash miraculous healing power and other supernatural movements of God when it was recited. This points toward the theory of Aramaic origin of the Essenes' name as the healers. They also believed in powerful, active prophetic gifting, and they were believed to actually be surprisingly reliable in what they said in these prophetic utterances about political changes and movements and things happening within the first century world. Now, the Essenes took the Sabbath very, very seriously, incredibly seriously, extremely seriously. As a brief refresher, recall that the Sabbath was established for God's people in keeping with God's own pattern of activity in the creation of the world in Genesis 1. God worked for 6 days, and on the seventh, he rested. And so God's people were also called to continue this pattern and work for 6 days and then rest on the seventh. The burning question for many Jews, even today, is what exactly qualifies as work on the Sabbath? Can you tend to your garden? Can you run down to the corner store if you forgot to buy more Dr. Pepper and more Reese's peanut butter cups? I don't say this out of any particular personal thing I forgot to do this week. I say this purely hypothetically. Can you use modern conveniences like electricity? Can you cook your meals that day, or do you have to prepare them beforehand? Some constructions of the Sabbath were very, very loose, and some were very strict. And perhaps the most strict were the Essenes. Hippolytus, the historian, records that many Essenes were so committed to avoiding any work on the Sabbath that they would not even rise up from their couches to go use the bathroom on the Sabbath. And that got pretty gross, but it is an indication of just how strict they were and how devoted they were to not doing any work at all on the Sabbath. Jesus had his own view about the Sabbath and its observance. And as we read at the very end of Mark chapter 2 and the very beginning of Mark chapter 3, this discussion takes place between Jesus and Pharisees. But I think it's safe to say that Jesus would have expressed very similar views about the Sabbath had he been talking to the Essenes. So let's pick up in Mark 2:23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Now, as a brief aside, it always amazes me how quickly the Pharisees and the Herodians, particularly in Mark's gospel, and the Herodians, of course, are the puppet rulers of Judea who were installed by the Romans. They were not Jewish themselves. How quickly that they decide that the only available option to them is to kill Jesus, is to murder him. This is another indication of that violent, chaotic first century world into which Jesus was born. But anyway, in these two stories, Jesus appears to be directly flouting the conventional wisdom of Sabbath observance. In the first story, he condones his disciples doing the simple work of picking off the heads of grain to eat, which for both the Pharisees and the Essenes would be a violation of the no-work policy of the Sabbath. Jesus' answer to the Pharisees, rooted in the history of King David and a time when David was a fugitive and in need of food for himself and his men, reveals that Jesus is not interested in using the Sabbath as an instrument to make life difficult or to stifle people in need. The command to rest was not meant to create a mountain of work in the attempt to obey it. Jesus sees Sabbath idolatry as being rampant among the Jews of the first century. They see it as a way to demonstrate their piety. The more strict your observance of the Sabbath, the more admirable you were for carrying around such a heavy burden on your backs. But Jesus exposes this mentality in a second story that we read when he asks the Pharisees, if I may paraphrase a little bit, if the Sabbath is meant for life or for death. Is it meant to celebrate the salvation of God? Or is it meant to make God's people the living dead, joyless monuments to rules and regulations set before them? This is what Jesus has in mind when he speaks at the end of Matthew chapter 11, after having encountered a crowd who had come into the wilderness to see John the Baptist and perhaps to see other Essenes. He says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." In his gospel, Matthew actually uses this saying of Jesus to launch into his own account of the story of the disciples picking grain and of the healing of a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. Matthew records Jesus reminding the assembled crowd that they would likely spring into action to save a sheep, one of their possessions, if it had fallen into a pit on the Sabbath. But how much more valuable than sheep are people? In a world full of confusion and violence and corruption, in a world of chaos, the Essenes retreated into an existence defined by tight regulations and ceaseless discipline. It made them devoted, but it also made them eccentric, to the point where they could no longer recognize the call of God. They were fascinated by God's name, but they were blind to God's activity in the world. They had become consumed by a pernicious kind of legalism that masquerades as righteousness, but leaves them empty and hollow. When the world is chaotic, we can easily become overwhelmed and ignore Jesus' call to find rest and joy in him and celebrate what he has done for us in the midst of our fear. If you're anything like me, I find myself wanting to do more and more and more and more to try to control and regulate more and more when I feel uneasy or fearful. But God has called me, and God's called you, to rest. I think that Christian musician Josh Garrels put it best in a song that he entitled "The Resistance." The music is very, very modern. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think lyrically he was really onto something when he wrote this: "My rest is a weapon against the oppression of man's obsession to control things. Look at the long line of make-believe kings, and the Lord of the Flies wants you to kiss his ring. Follow new rules with invisible strings, and become a puppet in a diabolical scheme. How do good men become a part of a regime when they don't believe in resistance?" As we've seen these last few weeks, Jesus did not shelter himself from the chaos of the first century world. Instead, he offered rest and rekindled joy in God that could be a beacon for a world lost in darkness. Now, next week, we'll be looking at one last group among the Jewish people, the Zealots, and their response to the problem of Roman rule. I hope that you will join us then. Please like and share this video on Facebook. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel and you happen to be watching us on YouTube, please do so. We'd love to have you as a subscriber so you never miss a study. The Lord bless you, and we'll see you next week.